this lecture, I'm going to talk about Edmund Burke, who lived from 1729 to 1797. Let me first say a bit about the structure of the lecture as such. Initially, I'm going to offer you some preliminaries, an explanation of who he was and of why his thought is interesting. Next, I'm going to talk about possibly the best-known aspect of Burke's work, his criticism of the early stages of the French Revolution. I'm then going to tackle a rather difficult issue concerning what Burke's underlying views were, a subject on which there's been a fair bit of controversy. And finally, I'm going to turn to the issue of why Burke is of enduring importance. Let me then start with some preliminaries. First, he was a fascinating, but in some ways really quite contentious figure. Who was he? Well, he was Irish. He had a legal training. He made a career, first of all, as a writer, and then as a British politician. He was a great orator. He was also a very powerful political writer. But he served very much as a spokesman for senior aristocratic political figures. He never had a cabinet position himself. You could say, in a sense, that he was employed, in modern terms, almost as a bit of a PR man, putting in fine ways points that the movers and shakers behind him were really wanting to have got over. Burke developed, in the course of his political writings and his oratory, some striking ideas, some ideas which in some ways are very much at odds with the way in which many people think about politics today. And it's this aspect of Burke's work which has been a really important influence on conservative thinkers. At the same time, when approaching Burke, it's important to bear in mind that his work was produced in, I guess what one could say is quite an unsystematic manner. What he was doing was offering comments on, reactions to, various different contemporary events as they were unfolding. He wasn't a professor. He wasn't sitting down to write big, systematic treatises. And indeed, he himself was critical of those people who wanted to take an approach to the understanding of politics and the world more generally, which played great stress on philosophical abstractions. He wasn't setting out to offer a philosophical system. He didn't sit down, indeed, and try and systematize and tidy up his own ideas, which means that I've got quite a task in front of me in trying just in these few minutes to give you a brief systematic account of what Burke himself was about. One consequence of the fact that he produced different sorts of ideas in relation to different kinds of problems is that there's been quite a bit of underlying debate as to whether he does have an overall philosophical system behind his views and as to what, if he does, those ideas are. And we'll touch on this and discuss this a bit. There's a sense, too, in which he is, at least at first cut, a somewhat paradoxical figure. Through much of his career, Burke was known as a supporter of moderate reform, not of making big changes in institutions, but he certainly wasn't the kind of person who opposed any change at all. He was also someone who was known for being on the side of the underdog. He was concerned about the Irish and the way in which they'd been treated badly by the British. He was concerned about India and the way in which people in India were being exploited. And so he was very much on the side of those people who were suffering from colonial exploitation. He favored, in broad terms, the American case in the Revolution. And yet, and this is the thing for which he's best known, he was passionate in his denunciation of the French Revolution, indeed in its very early stages, at a time when the French Revolution was fashionable and in which all moderate reformers and all less than moderate reformers were very much in favor of it. And so the things for which he's best known might seem in some ways a little bit out of kilter with much of the understanding of Burke that other people would have had. How will we proceed? Well, initially what I'm going to do is to focus on his criticism of the French Revolution, because this is the material for which he is best known, and it's out of this material which that we draw the ideas which have been most influential on conservatives. After this, we'll go to a slightly wider context to consider the problem of how what he said about the French Revolution relates to his other views, and to look at the issue of and contentious debate about what his underlying ideas were, and the issue of whether he is of relevance today. First of all, then, Burke against the French Revolution and his critique of its supporters. His key work here was Reflections on the Revolution in France, which was written in 1790. He starts with, and indeed Burke's focus is very much on, English radicals, people who were looking at the French Revolution and were getting really quite excited about it. And he focused here on an English radical writer called Richard Price. Price looked back to fairly recent historical change, about 100 years ago, from when they were writing in England, to the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, the constitutional change in which William and Mary, the Protestants, came to the throne, replacing the Catholic James I. And Price had claimed that if one looked back at these events about 100 years ago, they had established clear principles, that people had a right to choose their own governors and rulers. They had a right to call them to account, to cashier them for misconduct, and also that people had a right to frame government for themselves. So the radical was claiming in relatively recent events in British history there were these sorts of precedents. Burke, on the one side, took issue with this as a historical account of what had happened, but he also wanted to claim that the basis for rights wasn't, as Price wanted to claim, issues of abstract principle, general notions of the rights of man. Rather, Burke wanted to stress the idea that what is significant in the context in which he is writing are the rights of Englishmen rather than just the rights of man. What underlies this claim of Burke's? It highlights something which is really important about his work, namely his criticism of the appeal to ideas about natural rights. Burke quite characteristically claims that if people appeal in politics to ideas of natural rights, and I quote, the Commonwealth itself, the government itself, would in a few generations crumble away into the dust and powder of individuality. He fears, as it were, that appeals to natural rights will lead to an undermining of political order, and he is critical of the destructive power of appeals to abstractions. By way of contrast with this, one might ask, well, what did Burke actually favour? Burke is a bit difficult to sum up for the kind of reasons that I indicated before, but I think it's worth referring here to the following ideas. First of all, Burke takes the view that government should be a matter of prudential management and practical statesmanship rather than ruled by abstract principle. What's going on here? Well, let me offer you an analogy. Suppose that someone said to you, look, I will take you out for a meal to the very best restaurant in your city. And indeed, there are two new restaurants which have opened up. You've got a choice between them. In one of them, the guy who is the chef has got a master's degree in food science. He has also got one of the best collections of recipe books in the world. Okay, that's one of your options. The other one is someone who was an apprentice to one of the top chefs in Paris. Which choice would you make? Well, my guess is if you wanted a good meal as opposed to an, in quotation marks, interesting experience, you'd go with the guy who'd served his apprenticeship. And what Burke is concerned with is political skill as being something which is much more like the kind of thing that one has as a practical skill as a result of an apprenticeship, rather than something which can be a matter of applying abstract principles. So this is a key contrast to bear in mind. Second, he stresses that those people with political power should take into account the opinions and patterns of behavior of the people who they are dealing with. One might illustrate this in terms of thinking of town planners and paths. I mean, if you ever see these little maps that town planners build, little models and so on, they always kind of expect that people will follow the roads that are marked out for them rather than cutting across the middle of the grass and so on. In general, what Burke is saying is that if you're in a position of governing, what you have to do is to bear in mind what habits people have got, what dispositions they've got, what aptitudes they've got, what cut on the world they've got, and to work with that rather than somehow assuming that because you're pursuing some worthwhile goal, you can get people to do just what it is that you would like them to do. So he's saying again, not only is it important to see politics as an art, politics as a craft and as involving a skill rather than a matter of abstract principle, but the person who is good at politics is the person who is a proper judge of people and their concerns and dispositions. Above all, Burke stressed the significance of the British Constitution and of other constitutions and bodies of traditional law. Why? Well, first of all, he saw these things as being historical achievements, the authority of which depended very much on their history, on their being there, on the very fact that they were accepted, rather than on some notion that they could be grounded on abstract principles, on philosophy, and so on. Second, in his view, the best rulers were aristocrats. Why? Well, these, for Burke, were people who had behind them a tradition and a historical heritage, who had substantive property, who had a real stake in the country and how it went, who had also particular local knowledge and attachments, who really cared about the country, the people that they knew, the people who depended on them, and so on. At the same time, he stressed very strongly that if people had political power, they had a duty to the people to look after their concerns and interests rather than just to act on the basis of their own advantage. This, a historical heritage of the Constitution and obligations on the part of those people who are ruling with the appropriate skills to the population should, on his view, be seen as the basis of reform. That's to say, if things are going wrong, what you should do in Burke's view is to see how they can be put right in ways that serve to enhance and to prop up and to continue this tradition. You should appeal back to precedent, to tradition, rather than doing things which would undermine it and cut people adrift. It's also important that while you're doing this, while you're finding precedents for what you're doing, while calling people back to their historic duties, you also are pragmatic rather than standing on formal rights and entitlements. Again, it goes back to this notion of politics as a skill rather than a matter of reading out of some book what matters of abstract principle are. The Constitution itself is seen as precious historical achievement, but also as being vulnerable, and being vulnerable on two counts. On the one side, it's vulnerable to plausible-sounding appeals to reason, to rationality, to sort of schemes that people dream up. On the other side, he's concerned about populist appeals, about the way in which people may get worked up about things. Two, he's also concerned that the Constitution may become unbalanced. And one of his real preoccupations in the England of his day is the way in which the Crown and the Court, who he sees as, okay in their place, but really worrying if they get too much power, may be able to tip over and overbalance the Constitution. It's a little bit as if, in the American setting, someone was worried that the executive was getting too much power if they believed that really what you needed was a balanced constitution. And so one of Burke's concerns all along was to deal with problems and issues in such a way that they don't undermine the Constitution, that they don't undermine the balance of the Constitution. What serves to explain all of this, and what serves in particular to explain Burke's dislike of appeals to abstractions? There's been quite a bit of contention about it, but I've really been quite taken by a suggestion that a contemporary British academic, a guy who must be about my age, has made, a man called Ian Hampshire Monk. He's the editor of a journal called History of Political Thought, and he's written quite a bit about Burke. And what he has suggested is that one might make a contrast between two different interpretations of the idea of natural rights. On the one side, there's a view which some people attribute to John Locke, where people in the state of nature, an imagined situation prior to the existence of government, have got pretty well-defined rights. they offer a basis in which people can, go about their daily business, can recognize what other people's rights are, and can get along sort of pretty well. That these things then lead to problems, but they are preserved by and form the basis for government. That if you want to understand what government is doing, how its powers come about, you appeal back to rights that people had in the state of nature prior to there being government, and also where from Locke's perspective and those who follow him, you can appeal to ideas about natural rights as a basis on which you can call government to account. You can say government isn't here respecting people's rights, it's doing things that are wrong. By way of contrast with this, there's another view of natural rights, which one gets in Thomas Hobbes and also in another guy who's significant in this context called John Selden. On their view, natural rights sustain only the grimmest of forms of life, a kind of dog-eat-dog situation where people have got a natural right to do what they need to do in order to survive, but where just because people's rights and what people have to do to survive may conflict, you may have in a situation where people are simply appealing to what they've got a right to do by nature, a kind of dog-eat-dog situation where, as Thomas Hobbes put it, life in the state of nature, where they're just natural rights, is nasty, brutish, and short. And in their view, natural rights are something which have to be given up when people move into government, if life is going to be at all decent. And if people start appealing under government to notions of natural rights, this is going to dissolve everything. This is going to lead people back into the state of nature and the horrible condition that people are in there. On this second view, in the form given to it by Selden, to whom I referred, and where Hampshire Monk argues Burke refers to Selden in this context, government rests not so much on explicit agreements that it's set up, but on traditions and customs, which are internalized by the population. Indeed, Burke, referring to this kind of thing, talked about people as having prejudices. And he wasn't meaning something bad. He says, no, our rights, the possibilities of a decent life, all depend upon people's prejudices in the sense of particular cuts on the world, particular habits that people have got which will be different in different countries, but where people having the appropriate interlocking set of these things makes for a civilized life. These, on Burke's view, these historical products are the basis for people's real rights in different specific countries, but they'll obviously be specific to particular countries because they will fit in with the particular constitutions that you've got there, the particular habits that people have got in different countries. They, in Burke's view, are conventional. They've just grown up through time. They're not something that are capable of rational demonstration. And indeed, for Burke, they may rest on historical fictions. For example, people in the British tradition and other countries that have come from it might appeal to the Magna Carta. Now, historians may tell us, well, the Magna Carta really isn't actually a fundamental guarantee of people's rights. Very much Burke's view is, well, it doesn't really matter what it actually was. The important thing is what people believe it to be and that it works. And you see, the kind of picture that's coming here, we have a whole set of conventions, a whole set of traditions, a whole way of seeing things, and that it's this that is important for civilized life. It's this that guarantees the specific rights that people have got in particular countries. You can't demonstrate this stuff abstractly. And Burke wanted to claim against the reformers of his day that the alternative to such conventions and so on wasn't, as the supporters of reform were claiming, the rule of reason, but in fact something that got us back to the state of nature. The only alternative was something which would really only allow the barest and most miserable of existence. And in Burke's view, we get to this if we try to conduct politics on the basis of abstract principle, that it sort of gnaws away at and undermines the kind of niceties that make a decent life possible. And Burke's view was that even in the early days of the French Revolution, when other people thought what was going on was fine, that what had happened and what was starting to happen there was something which would be dreadful and which would turn out really badly. And one of the annoying things, particularly for radicals at the time and ever since, was that Burke turned out to be right. Burke also expressed concern about attacks on religion that were going on at the time. Why? Well, on the one side, Burke was himself a sincere religious believer, and he was really upset that people were attacking religion. Second, he saw religion as having an important role in political life. Religious authority, he thinks, keeps ordinary people in order. You know, if you're concerned that God has got his eye on you, that may make you... But what's most important for Burke is that it keeps really powerful people in order too. If rulers know that they have at the end of the day to answer to God, they may be a little less ready to simply pursue their own interests and rather think a bit more of the interests of the people. He was also shocked by the open profession of atheism in France and was upset by the confiscation of church property. This was important to him because it undermined what he thought was a really important role of religious institutions in that society, namely as corporate bodies which were separate from the state. Why was this his concern? Well, he thought that it was important that there were bodies aside from the state, which had a continued existence over time, which had substantial property and wealth as a check on arbitrary government. He said, you know, if all power is concentrated in the government, there is nowhere to go. There is nowhere to go for relief. If you've got different powerful bodies around, ones which have got substance to them, tradition to them, and wealth, then they serve as a check on government exercising its will in arbitrary ways. Burke was also concerned about the political reform and the character of political reform which was taking place in the France of his day. He was concerned on the one side that the changes in the electoral system that they were making were undermining close links that there'd been before between constituents and their representatives. Indeed, Burke had a very distinctive view about political representation. He stressed the notion that people should be representatives of the particular places where there were electors, but he stressed at the same time the significance of the independent judgment of those people who are elected. He said, these people aren't delegates. They shouldn't be delegates. Rather, you elect someone then to exercise their judgment on your behalf, but on behalf of what's to the good of the country, rather than electing a delegate who, if some new issue comes back, has to come back and consult with you. And he said, no, what we need are people who've got appropriate ties, appropriate contacts, but who you then elect so that they use their own judgment, their own nous, to come to good conclusions. He was worried too about the changes as undermining local attachments, which he was afraid would lead to a kind of social atomization. Again, he stresses the importance of specific local characters and characteristics, and he's against anything which seems, in a sense, just to treat everyone as abstract individuals. He's worried too about who these people were. They were often lawyers and doctors, people who were perfectly good people, but who, for Burke, suffered from the real problem that they didn't have political experience. I mean, go back to the case of the chef. You wouldn't want someone who wasn't a chef without training to be making the meal, however good an upright he was, however good a lawyer he was. Now, in a similar way, Burke is saying, look, what you want are people who actually have got some experience, who know something about the craft of politics. He was concerned as well about how radical political reform might call the loyalty of the army into question. And he wanted to stress here that the loyalty of a powerful body of people in a society is something which depends on traditions and emotions. It can't be something which you can just sort of treat in a purely pragmatic way, in a business-like way. I mean, he, I think, would be very upset about the changes in the armed forces that have been taking place at the moment, where you essentially treat the armed forces like a branch of business and say, no, it's something really very different. In his own day, the worry was the political loyalty of the armed forces. In our day, I think his concern would be, no, you need to keep up the traditions of these people. You need to keep them up as a sort of distinctive form of life because they're being asked to perform in ways that are very different from the rest of the population. What in all of this is going on, and what are Burke's underlying views? At various points in his argument, Burke appeals to natural law and to utility. Natural law being principles perhaps founded on human nature, sort of timeless moral principles. Utility, issues about what makes for the greatest good of the greatest number of people, what makes for social well-being. He also at times in his writings makes common cause with Adam Smith's economics. He said he agreed with Smith about economic matters. These have been appealed to when people have tried to make a kind of systematic approach to Burke. Often people have taken up one or other of these themes and said, it's natural law, or it's utility, or it's kind of parallels with Smith's free market stuff, which enables you to make a kind of systematic interpretation of Burke. These have been made the basis of interesting but conflicting interpretations. The problem, I think, about them is that each of them seems plausible, but none of them is fully satisfactory. There are additional problems. He appeals in the course of his argument to natural law in respect of colonial injustices in India. He approves of the American Revolution, but he's critical of the French Revolution. What is one to do with all of this? Well, here I will step in where angels fear to tread and offer an attempt at an interpretation. First of all, I think in Burke's view, good government depends on traditions and conventions, and ideally for him, it is aristocratic and Christian in its character. Second, one faces terrible dangers if one undermines this by appealing to natural rights. For rights for Burke are matters of tradition and convention. They're not something that's natural, they depend on habit and prejudice. If conventional rights are undermined, the result isn't the rule of reason, but the rule of violence. The American Revolution for him was fine. Well, it was okay anyway, because what was being appealed to here were traditional English rights, notions about no taxation without representation, and there wasn't an attempt to remake the entire society. In the case of India, Burke does appeal to natural law. In the face of flagrant injustice, Burke, I think, isn't a relativist. He doesn't say, whatever happens anywhere is okay. But I think, in his judgment, natural law is very general, in many respects rather unspecific, and something to which appeal can really only be made in very extraordinary situations. Some Burke specialists, indeed, have warned us to be a bit careful about these appeals, saying, look, bear in mind that he was a rhetorician and speaking often in Parliament and so on, and that sometimes what politicians appeal to as matters of grave principle really don't last too far beyond those speeches. Other people say, no, this is really the key to it. But these disputes go on. What, after all, is one to make of Burke? What is his enduring importance? Well, first of all, he has a clear and pretty obvious appeal for conservatives. Despite the unsystematic and rhetorical character of his views, they're a mine of valuable insights, both in terms of specific arguments, but also of really very powerful images. Second, he has an acute view of the dangers of uncritically rationalist approaches to politics. His claims about the likely consequences of these in the French Revolution were vindicated. People really thought he was a terrible alarmist, saying the French Revolution would lead to blood, but it did. And there's a sense in which his argument has been echoed consciously or unconsciously by many people who've criticized the kind of idealism behind some forms of totalitarianism, saying, no, this is going to lead to disaster. In my view, Burke's approach is of great value too, and this may seem a bit strange, to would-be reformers. His awareness of and insistence on people as acting out of prejudice is something that I think the would-be reformer really has to take seriously. One needs to recognize people as being socialized. One needs to recognize people as being Americans or British or Australians, or indeed people who come from a very specific, localized background, and saying what will work here with these people won't work with these people. And indeed, I think that if reformers are going to be effective, they need to recognize that what they're working with are people in this sense rather than people they can just treat as abstractions. Going back to the planners and the paths, planners really have to bear in mind what people are actually like, how they're going to behave, or if, as I have to do from time to time, one has to go on a diet, one has to take a realistic view of oneself and one's dispositions, rather than thinking, in a sense, that by making a few clear New Year resolutions, a bit like appeals to natural rights, one can then just undo all of one's habits and ways of behaving. Indeed, I think that a close attention to Burke's concerns has important lessons for everybody. And this is something that, indeed, I think I've learned for myself, because as recently as 1996, I argued in a book that I published, and I quote, "An exaggerated respect for Burke is perhaps the mark of poor judgment in a political theorist," and I think now that I have to eat my words. Let me just recap in terms of what we did in this lecture. First, I went over some preliminaries. I said something about who Burke was and why his thought is interesting. I then said something about his critique of the French Revolution and his critique of an appeal to abstract rights. We then discussed Burke's underlying views, some of the issues there, some of the controversies. I offered an interpretation, and finally I concluded by saying a little about his enduring importance, both to conservatives, but also to the would-be reformer. Thank you.